Sanibonani. Sanibonani. Dumelang. Di Macheroni. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much, Professor Adubajo Adekeye, for organizing this and for making the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation a dynamic one. I would like to acknowledge the presence of senior members of the University of Johannesburg. I saw Professor Sina. I'm sure you must be tweeting now already. I also would like to acknowledge our friends and our guests coming all the way from all over the world, some from across the border, some from across the oceans. Thank you very much for making time to come and engage at the University of Johannesburg. I also saw senior leaders of various institutions in South Africa. I saw Professor Ahmed Bawa sitting quietly, and Rukeya, welcome back to the University of Johannesburg. And also I saw the CEO of the HSRC. You are welcome. So thank you very much for coming. The University of Johannesburg is the largest university in Johannesburg. And Ahmed, you can do the numbers. And the size, sometimes we are told that size is not important. Size is important because it means the number of people we touch as a university are bigger than the number of people if we were otherwise smaller. But I think what is also special about the University of Johannesburg, now that we are talking about the issue of transformation from the Ivory Towers to the Ebony Towers, the university is able to graduate almost half of the people who are the first in their families to ever walk into the gate of a university. So we are basically shaping the futures of families that have never really seen higher education. And I think you can really give us a round of applause. And we also believe that the university must serve society. And what has happened, especially in the African continent, is that our top researchers solve problems of other people. If you look in the medical sciences, we still have people who are solving disease profiles that do not necessarily reflect the disease profiles of our continent. So I know, Professor Adekeye, you even use a bombastic word to describe that. You call it colonization of the mind. I would like to simplify this matter. I think it is really about changing the fortunes of our peoples. And if we are going to change the fortunes of our peoples, then we have to solve problems that are confronting our people. And we should not isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. This is not either or. We can do both. We should not intellectually isolate ourselves, but we should also not alienate ourselves from the problems that are around us. So the university has been quite engaged on a project to understand our society. We have just launched the Africa Biography project, where we are going to be writing 10 biographies of African leaders in the next 5 years. We are funding that. And the reason for that was because when we observed, we realized that you have many leaders who have been very influential in our continent, but there's no material that you can be able to read. You know, Wikipedia can only go to a certain extent. We need an intellectual interrogation of our leaders, identify their mistakes, identify their successes, and learn from it. And I know, I see the presence of Professor Mutambara, who is also writing, he's not waiting for somebody else to write a biography about him. He is writing it himself so that we can know what he thought and learn from that.
I want to start also by thanking our amazing conference team. I may not get a chance, as this is the only time I'm actually on the schedule. Dr. Donaga led the team of Cecilia, Kathy, and Mary, our magnificent four, to deliver this logistically complex event through many months of tireless dedication. UJ's bureaucracy also often appears, to me at least, to be a Byzantine enterprise run by powerful lords of the manor in various gilded secret societies. It is thus always a relief to find the pockets of excellence who make things tick. And I want to thank Dale Kitchen, Colin Maepa, who were heroic in the marketing and media departments. Hester delivered the program in her tough, efficient manner. Theodora and the library staff were, as always, very helpful. I want to thank the UJ Art Center where we are, who were also quite tireless, and our videographer, Kevin, who put together the Institute video and is filming this today. I want to thank also, of course, the UJ leadership in particular for their support. Their dedication for the transformation agenda is highlighted here by the presence of the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Mawala, the two deputies responsible for research, my indefatigable boss, Professor Sinha, and teaching, Professor Parek, who will join us shortly, and the executive director in the VC's office, and some suggest the power behind the throne, Dr. Vukuza. I also want to acknowledge Professor Motala, who has been a consistent source of sound advice and will be a co-editor of the book with my colleague and research coordinator, Cecilia Nedziwe. Professor Motala's co-conspirator, Professor Michael Cross, will also chair a session for us. I want to thank Ahmed Bauer for his help in helping to conceptualize the project right from the start, in Morgan being in Killarney, and his willingness always to suggest names at every stage of the process. Transformation is not a theoretical issue, and one must never assume that everyone is for it, but it is somehow simply not happening due to some invisible systemic failure. If we want transformation to succeed, we will clearly have to fight for it. It will not be handed over on a silver platter. This conference, in a sense, thus represents another skirmish in what is likely to be a long, tortuous battle. In my 15 years in South Africa, my final thoughts now, I have met students of development studies who have never heard of Adebayo Adedeji, Thandika Mkandawire, Walter Rodney. Literature students who think that Buchi Emecheta and Amaita Aidu are traditional medicines. Politics students who think Ali Mazrui, Amina Mama, and Claude Ake are exotic fetishes. Sociologists who have never read Ben Magubane and Archie Mafeji. Undergraduate students who have never been taught by any black professors. This is clearly not a sustainable situation. And even the syllabi of some of the most progressive black professors in our universities here have often failed to reflect the intellectual diversity and geographical location of South Africa in Africa. There is so much to do and so little time to do it in. Let us commit ourselves over these next 2 days to starting the journey now in order to avoid the wrath of Africa's ancestors in invoking a curse on us for our failure to take into account African epistemologies, scholars, and wisdom in engaging the rest of the world in intellectual battle. God bless Africa.
Good morning. I would like to take a few minutes to thank the University of Johannesburg Vice Chancellor and the Institute of Pan-African Thought and Conversation, and Ade Adebayo and his team for organizing and inviting me to this conference, and all those who came to participate. My name is Claudia Fratelli. I'm a program officer at Carnegie Corporation of New York, a foundation founded in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie, whose mission is to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding. The corporation has devoted its efforts towards the two issues Andrew Carnegie considered of paramount importance: international peace and the advancement of education and knowledge. Within the international program, the corporation's Higher Education and Research in Africa program, which started in 2000, currently comprises 3 areas: postgraduate training and research, and has supported about 1,700 postgraduate students since 2007. Academic linkages between the academic diaspora and African universities, working on projects in curriculum development, postgraduate training, and joint research. And the third component being African higher education policy and research, and this conference falls within policy and research. This conference is the first support to the corporation has provided to University of Johannesburg, so congratulations to Ade. I would add that the corporation has supported curricula transformation from its very beginning. I recently read in the archives a trip report from the foundation's first trip to Africa in 1927, entitled An Educational Program in Africa. To quote the then president, Frederick Keppel, he said, and this was the trip to South Africa and Kenya in 1927, "In going through the lower classrooms during our African travels, we were continually drawing attention to the pitifully unsuitable textual and illustrative content of the primers and education posters," referring to the British primers and posters. "I am strongly in favor of cooperating in preparation and publication of suitable teaching material for the lower grades." The corporation then went on to fund development of teaching materials. It's unfortunate we are still addressing this topic a century later, but the relevance of curricula will continue to be essential. And I'm pleased to be here to learn about recent developments in curricula transformation in South Africa, other African countries, and the US, and what that means for the future, both in Africa and in the rest of the world, where higher education is under pressure from cuts in funding, increased access, and relevance to labor market transformation. So thank you again, and I'm looking forward to the next couple of days.
So just to say then very quickly, colleagues, that these next positions, and I'm very happy to share the paper, come out of centers that are really important for us to understand as sites of inquiry inside of South Africa. So Adi has spoken about the Johannesburg Center. There are other centers too. Most unlikely place is UNISA. And Catherine Adora Hoppers there is absolutely critical. And she makes this argument for taking what she calls education by enlargement. And a key phrase which she uses there is that the Western, and please read that, the Western package is inadequate to the task of bringing up children who have other frames of reference. And she goes on to say and she looks at how children grow up, and making the argument that those children, and it's what Chilidzi was saying, need access to the whole bounty of knowledges that are available right now. From quantum physics to thinking about the botanical riches, as she says there, that are in that child's front of house. And so her essential position is that right now we must be working with all of the frameworks that are available to us, but also work with all of them critically. You cannot treat any of them in a privileged way. The last one is Andre Keats' position, and this is at a new center which is emerging at Nelson Mandela University, the Center for Critical Studies. And he is in an implicit argument with Catherine Adora Hoppus. He makes the argument that education by enlargement is not sufficient. Now, he's not fully articulated that, but I think he's making that argument because he's saying that enlargement doesn't deal with those ways in which European forms of knowledge come with baggages that we still need to be engaging with and removing even in their toxic ways from our repertoires of education. And so his approach is rather that we need to excavate. Excavation is what is crucial now. So I close, colleagues, and I'm sorry for taking more time than I should, but just to say to you that the real value of what this discussion has done is put to us in a way which we now are obliged to engage with in deep kinds of ways, is this big European inheritance of what race means. And it's the most important thing I'd like to say that the decolonial discussion needs to be concentrating on, because it has its own reproductive modalities, which some of these positions are asking us to pay attention to. Thank you very much.
The Fees Must Fall movement, again, affects only 5% of South Africans aged between 15 and 34, and university students, and of these only, these are the university students. But most significantly in South Africa, there are 34% of our students who are unemployed, who are called NEETs, not in education, employment, and training, who number about 4 million. And really, this is potentially a socially explosive situation. So the development of that sector, the post-school sector, continues to be something that preoccupies all of us. In Uganda, Malawi, and Kenya, there's been a movement from free higher education for cost sharing to ensure that the university resource bases are both consolidated and diversified, and I hope this reassures my Vice Chancellor. Having said that, the student lobby was very strong on the view of free education for all, and I think it is an important issue to be debated and discussed. Their main issue was that, is it useful actually to differentiate between rich and poor students? We're talking about fairly complex means testing, poverty mechanisms to address who and what students are in order for them to access free education. They've also suggested that we must address issues such as taxation, possibly looking at a wealth tax, structural changes in the economy, getting rid of corruption in order to ensure free education for all. And I think that is not off the agenda. It needs serious attention. I think of particular concern in the last while for those of us who are studying what all of this means is what is meant by this income contingent loan. It will require substantial initial investment, a responsive banking sector, but most important, parents will have to be brought on board and advocated around what this means. I'm about to conclude. I just want to finally conclude by education as a public good, and I think in the recent literature there have been two ways in which this has been conceptualized. On the one hand, there's the issue of qualifications, knowledge production, innovation, which lead to political, economic, and social manifestations of the public good. On the other, there's a view of the public good that emphasizes its role in reducing prejudice, increasing democratization, critical thinking, and promoting active citizenship. I think whatever the definitions are, what is absolutely clear in South Africa is that higher education returns are higher than schooling, and South Africa has one of the highest returns to higher education in the world. Against this backdrop, we have a system which is characterized by low government investment, low effective participation, and high costs. And what's absolutely clear that much greater investment is needed if we want to actually meet our commitment to developing human capital and having a much more robust economy. Finally, I'm just going to conclude with these points, Chair. I think what has come is that there is agreement on certain key principles in terms of where we want to be in terms of funding. This is full cost of provision for the neediest students. The missing middle who are outside NSFAS criteria must be supported through a combination of grants and loans. Funding for higher education must increase, possibly by looking at taxation again. And finally, a revision of GDP for our research and development from 0.7 to 1 or 1.5%. I think our call is that no academically achieving student must be excluded because they cannot afford it, and they should be able to study in the institution of his or her choice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shirin.
Thank you.
The biggest success in the work that, that Professor Marwala and I comes from this very deep-seated philosophy of reductionism. And there's a growing trend now which indicates that reductionism has reached its maximum kind of outputs, and that we really have to begin to think about integrative approaches, even in theoretical physics. Think about integrative approaches to developing new knowledge. The big question is, are there ways of connecting that with our own philosophies around integrative approaches, which are so prevalent in places like South Africa? Third one is the coexistence of multiple knowledge systems in societies like ours. Just the fact that we have individuals who coexist in multiple knowledge systems and who really have to kind of really navigate these knowledge systems in their everyday lives. Again, a whole lot of writing about this, but what I want to kind of point out is that very often these knowledges are subjected to a hierarchical kind of analysis, if you like, that prevails at our universities. And they get excluded. There's an epistemic exclusion of them. And what that means basically is that we really have to go back and create spaces where these different knowledge systems can come together, can come into a conversation together. Right, concluding remarks. It seems to me that if South Africa's transformation to a caring, nurturing, complex democracy depends on its capacity to provide, we have to produce a social imaginary that is deeply steeped in a social justice framework. We have to begin to develop an ontology and an epistemology for more complete liberation that the 1994 movement did not produce. And we have to think about the foundations of a knowledge enterprise that is deeply linked to the foundations of engagement, if you like. Engagement with new publics. The colonial system was linked to its publics in a very direct way. The question is, how do we design a university system that's much more intricately linked with its publics? The big challenge for South Africa's universities is that we will be part of the social engine that produces those changes, but at the same time, we'll be transformed by those changes. So there's a kind of complex situation there that we have to manage. And let me just complete then by saying that for a university system, fundamental shifts will have to emerge through this engagement with its new publics, shaping their relationship with society without stripping it away of any of its critical edge, its capacity to produce new generations of graduates and scholars who will bear critical skills, integrity, and capacity to engage in ethical thinking, and the ability to engage complexity. At an individual level, I'm quoting D.A. Foster, who happens to be a theologist. He says, to be able to identify and place oneself within the world is a crucial element of one's well-being. Ontologically, it shapes the image we have of ourselves, as well as our relation to others, and ultimately informs our understanding of the place we understand ourselves to occupy within the whole of the cosmos. Perhaps the same applies to universities. Thank you.
So good morning, colleagues. I'm Anjana Parekh. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Johannesburg and your chair for this second important session. The title of this session is Transforming Historically Black Universities in South Africa and in the United States, and we have two speakers, and I will introduce you to them as they come up to the podium. The issue is, why the focus on historically black universities? I think I was listening to the morning, early morning presentations, and there was somebody who made a comment earlier on, are we romanticizing, or something to that effect, romanticizing the past? And I sometimes wonder, it's not about romanticizing the past, but are we forgetting our histories as well? That in our desire to become a system that is globally renowned, that we forget the role that was played by a number of our universities prior to 1994. I came across the term a while back, but it came back to me more recently, the term redacted. And somehow I seem to think that we are reducting the role of historically black universities from our narrative about higher education and the role of higher education going forward.
Within the context of postgraduate study, now and then all institutions struggle, but for HDIs, it becomes even more problematic or a challenge in a sense that, first of all, even though the students would have gone to an HDI institutions, they wouldn't want to go back there and do a postgraduate program. Alternatively, if I have studied at Wits, why would I want to go and do a postgraduate program at Forte or at Zululand or Venda, for that matter? You know, so while they would want to improve their research output, the challenges that they face, to the extent possible, getting the appropriate students for them to be able to learn, to do more. But also the question of research staff, the question of how do we, within the context of developing the new academics, even if within the context of the new funding, the end gap by the Department of Higher Education and Training, yes, we do get, but you find that time and time again, they leave the institution after they've got their master's or after they've got their PhD to move on to better opportunities. But also attracting academics to historically disadvantaged institutions. Look at Forte, for instance. Its location. But the issue of location could be both a problem, but also an opportunity. And the question is, how do we use it? But in most of the time, it becomes a challenge in a sense that who wants to go and stay at Alice? Who wants to go and stay in Toho and Do? What is it that would entice the academics to be able to find their way in those universities? I also thought that within the context of today's development, we know that South Africa, as an example, has 11 official languages. I think it's 12 now because of the sign language. But to what extent are we committed, both as a government, but also as the institutions in the development of our languages? Within the context of decolonization, everybody wants the outcome or the output or the outcome, but they're not necessarily concentrating on what are we doing to actually improve our languages. I'll give you an example again. University of Zululand had a a Zulu dictionary project, which was established by Professor Kabi in the early 70s. That project doesn't have a home until recently. It doesn't have a home. It tells you that we want to improve our languages, but we do not want to put the effort required to support them, both in terms of government, but also in terms of how, as universities, are reacting to language development. And I think it becomes crucial when we speak of decolonization, to the extent possible, within the context of our culture, how do we develop, what role do we play in the development of our languages? I always say to myself, if I had my way, I would require each university to have a program that requires them to actually demonstrate what role they play in the development of our languages as a point of departure. But in any way, the crucial aspect, last one, in conclusion, has to do with our notion of access into higher education, in a sense that we know that since 1994 up until today, our sector can only take not more than 1 million students. But we argue and say we want to increase access. And how do we demonstrate the extent to which we are increasing access if we are not able to increase the number of institutions, but also, alternatively, to increase the capacity of our current institutions to be able to cope with the demands? The size and shape debate, to the extent possible, how is it contributing to providing opportunities to the many possible students coming from our schooling system? Thank you.
I begin by offering my gratitude to the conference organizers for this opportunity to participate in what's really an epic and historic series of meetings, this being the second in the conversations across the African diaspora. So, Prof. Ade, we thank you for that. And I thank the Vice Chancellor in this university for hosting us, as well as acknowledge my distinguished colleagues who are presenting here. I tried to finesse 45 minutes from Cecilia Moyo, and she said absolutely not, finished. So I will work hard to get through this presentation in the time allotted. My slides, I imagine I request that the next slides show up. Is that how I change them? Or do I have a clicker or something? I think it's a human clicker. Oh, human clicker. All right, next slide then, please. That will give you an overview of the agenda for the remarks that I will be offering this morning, this afternoon. Simply talking about the origins of U.S. higher education and looking at HBCUs within context, which has been emphasized by many of the previous speakers. And the context in the U.S. is a context that was defined by a history of slavery, and following slavery, the creation of caste-like status for African Americans that continues into today, and with real and very serious political, economic, and social consequences impacting education. And out of that history of disadvantage has come a reality of historically black colleges and universities that were created as a space for inequality, separate and unequal, but that black folks in our infinite creativity and dedication to resistance around the world, and in the U.S. in particular in this instance, converted and transformed into a space of empowerment and a space of resistance and pushing for change that would make the country live up to its obligations and to its promises in that document, the U.S. Constitution. So in the next couple of slides, you just see reference to the founding of U.S. higher education in the system of racial inequality, in a system of racial democracy that made promises of equality, but then added the qualification that it did not, those promises did not and would not apply to people of African ancestry, people who had been brought there as slaves. But nevertheless, from that founding moment, our institutions, the most prominent and prestigious institutions of higher ed in the U.S., were funded by black bodies and the work of black people. Slaves were sold to pay for the establishment of prestigious universities. Slave labor was relied upon to build and develop those universities, and so on. But as I indicated in the next slide, despite the systematic denial of access to African Americans for education, period, and let alone higher education, because as most of you in this room are aware, the history of educational access for black people in the U.S. was very tragic. I mean, when we were slaves and in those earlier years following slavery, it literally was to take one's life at risk to teach black people to read, to expose them to education. As one of my colleagues pointed out, you could do anything to black people, you could do anything to slaves, but teach them to read and write. And that gives you a very clear sense of that denial and how important it was in the processes of trying to keep us disenfranchised and keep us subjugated.
So to the members of the movement, the expressions "Rose must fall" meant different things. Although the movement was subject to attack from state and university forces, our biggest threat was our inability to translate the rich literature and data from our lived experiences into practice. Although Audre Lorde's famous declaration that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house was popularized within the movement by black feminists, a certain faction of the movement had done just that by adopting a toxic, masculine, militarized approach to student activism. It is the kind of activism that expects people to put their bodies on the line and mental health on the line, whilst copying out or actively making the space unsafe for all black people. Despite the theoretical commitment to intersectionality, the movement was ableist from the get-go. It was through the activism of disability champions such as Khanyisa Ntombini 2 years later that issues of mental health and disability were brought into the mainstream decolonial conversations. An important criticism of the movement's initial modus operandi was not a lack of reimagining of protests outside of occupations, shutdowns, and marches, but that we never really made our protests accessible to differently able people. There were no ramps that allowed wheelchair users to be able to occupy physical space. There was no comprehensive mental health problem to deal with the inevitable mental health issues that came with embarking on a decolonial project. As a result, those students who had to be reintegrated into society after being tear-gassed, shot at with rubber bullets, suspended and criminalized, have acquired severe lifelong mental health problems. And there is still no comprehensive solution to help the affected student protesters to overcome their acquired mental health issues. So, once the movement became unsafe for us black queer femmes, we started to carve out smaller enclaves within the decolonial project. One of them is the Trans Collective, which is a trans feminist movement, which was formed by Sandile Ndelu and I at the heart of Azania 2. That was the occupation at Avenue House. The space for an organization like the Trans Collective has resulted from a gap in the mainstream dialogue and political action, which invisibilizes the complexities, narratives, experiences, pain, and oppression of trans and gender non-conforming bodies and psyches. We position ourselves at the front lines of decolonization, using our voices and bodies to lobby for our needs and wants. We are reclaiming our space in the globalized decolonization movement and calling for our narratives to be instructive going forward. Moreover, we problematize the fact that thus far, the gender nuance of this decolonization project has privileged cisgender voices. Thus, it is our position that although decolonization necessarily requires degendering, this can only happen after a process of decisgendering. By degendering and decisgendering, we are ascribing a language to the process of thinking and reimagining our understandings of gender. The last slide. Rape at Tanzania, can you believe? Allegations of rampant sexual violence within the movement started within the first weeks of the movement. In fact, it was the gender-based violence that prompted the formation of the IAC. The Intersectionality Audit Committee had proposed a gender desk within the first occupation. It took many incidents of sexual abuse for the black queer femmes of the movement to eventually call it quits, but the peak of our disillusionment has to be rape at Tanzania. The person whose human dignity was violated through rape documented her experience on Facebook. She narrates, "I was sleeping and then I wake up to feel fingers up my vagina. I then wake up to cry in the bathroom and try and wake up the men in the space. The men in the space did not immediately offer their assistance. By this time, the majority of the black femmes in the space had left because of the same fears, but some black femmes did not have the luxury of their own shelter and had to stay in Tanzania. In effect, Tanzania was only a safe space for black men. Rape at Tanzania is a testament to the fact that black queers and femmes cannot continue to organize with the type of black men who violate black femmes."
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be reading from my paper as experiences from the Vets Fees Must Fall picket line. And because of time, I'm going to be reading very quickly, and I'm hoping that I'll be audible enough. So the Fees Must Fall campaign started at Wits University on the 14th of October after the university management announced a 10.5% fees increase for the 2016 academic year. The protest took off at an already fertile ground nationally and at Wits. Nationally, the Rhodes Must Fall movement from the University of Cape Town had started a campaign for decolonization since March 2015. Most importantly, historical institutions like Tshwane University of Technology, historically black institutions like Tshwane University of Technology and Fort Hare University, among others, have been fighting financial exclusion since history can remember. However, the Fees Must Fall campaign came to be associated with Wits due to the status of historically white institutions like UCT that attracted white media, the public, and international attention. The Fees Must Fall movement at Wits, like other public universities, was characterized by a unique alliance between protesting students and outsourced workers, and this alliance continues through 2016. The movement reached its peak with the announcement of 0% fees for 2016 by former President Jacob Zuma at the Union Buildings on the 23rd of October 2015. The movement re-emerged in 2016 with excessive repression by universities and the state through police violence. Police violence and court interdicts, exclusions and arrests of students coupled with internal crises of lack of democracy and gender struggles forced the movement into retreat by the end of 2016. In this paper, I draw from personal experiences from the picket line of Fees Must Fall protests at Wits University, mass meetings from the 14th of October 2015 to the end of November 2016, and observations from some of the major marches, conversations with protesting students and staff members, and a series of transformation meetings held at Wits as part of decolonization project. I also draw extensively from the book Writing and Writing, The Diaries of Wits Follies, published in 2017, a collection of Fees Must Fall activists from Wits University documenting their experiences of participation in the movement. I argue that the Fees Must Fall campaign at Wits University embodied discourses of decolonization, decommodification and transformation through strategies, tactics, repertoires, and the very presence of bodies at the picket line. The protest spoke to the history, present, and future in one moment through questioning, imagining, and reimagining an inclusive university system for a Black African child. It displayed beauty and pain, dismay and hope at the same time through bodies of powerful and yet anxious young people who have had enough of structural violence and systematic racism that continues to exclude them from the system of higher education. The paper is by no means an attempt to hijack or represent experiences of Wits Fismus 4 activists, as this cannot be represented by an individual. While the paper draws from collective group activities, the narration of events is based on my own personal understanding and interpretations of events informed by different spaces that I occupy. My analysis is through the lens of multi-layered experiences and positions I occupy as a Black graduate from a poor background whose access to university was only made possible by NSFAS, a graduate student in white studies, which is sociology at Wits, funded by a white research institute, and a Black young woman navigating a white male-dominated space of academia. So as a point of departure, I asked who are the protesters at the picket line at Wits University. And then I argue that depending on where you are standing in history, present, and the future, Fismus Fall activists at Wits University wear multiple identities. These are either imposed or they are self-defined. Reading through dominant narratives of white media, they are hooligans, a small group of individuals who are lazy, underprepared for their exams, and want to cause disruptions for their personal benefits. Through the eyes of the 1976 and the older generation, they are a born-free generation that is careless and does not value the hard-earned democracy fought and died for by others. The Fismus Fall activists, through the lens of ultra-right, whites, and middle-class Black, are a group of angry Blacks who simply cannot move beyond the narrative, of apartheid injustices, who refuse to accept the rainbow nation and equal opportunities.
So I'm going to leap to my conclusions. Please read the paper for all of the gory details. But the conclusions are this: that the protests of 2015, Rhodes was known as an apolitical institution. The SRC had no politics. In fact, during protests, the SRC was called the MRC because they were the Management Representative Council. So during the 2015, it was a political awakening which is transformative in itself. And during this time, students brought their bodies collectively to what had merely been intellectual ideas and policy frameworks around transformation in order to recenter the poor Black student in the university's imagination. And it would seem that the lessons they were teaching us were about the gap that exists between the beautiful policies that can't be faulted and the actual actions, and the reluctance to do things, to answer things honestly. You know, when I've heard my colleagues speaking, it's as though the VCs had a script and the same things were being said. You know, anyway, let me not go there. The second observation is that we missed this opportunity. That where, and I feel this so intensely about Rhodes University, which is a small university, and where we could have worked so much harder to negotiate through these things. There were very hectic, intense, difficult negotiation processes. But at the, you know, as soon as one person said the wrong thing, the VC would walk out or the negotiations would break down. And it's almost, you know, there was a reluctance to go, no, we're going to stay here until we find an answer. We could have done that, and we missed that opportunity. And so the violence that then ensued in the April 2016 protests and in the October 2016 protests, and this thing of business as usual, when we had spent the night running from cops, trying to catch people, trying to find people, going to the hospital, taking blankets and food to the jail, you know, when really it was incredibly, people have not recovered from the trauma that happened on the Rhodes campus at that time. And then it was business as usual. And so there's this divide that has opened between what is said officially and what people believe on the ground. And unfortunately, you know, I haven't had I wrote the paper, but I couldn't come with an optimistic ending, because I honestly don't know how we get back from there. I don't know how we fix. It feels like we missed the opportunities to learn important lessons. And I'm just hoping that the young African scholars that continue to do work in this regard will continue to challenge the universities, particularly the formerly white universities. I think I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Good afternoon to the resilient group this afternoon. It's a late shift, and thank you for being here to listen. I'd also just like to greet everybody, warm greetings, but as well as express thanks to the conference organizers for inviting me. So what I'll do this afternoon is I'm going to stick to the script, because once I see all of you, I'm going to want to engage and connect, and I know I'll lose my train of thought by giving other examples that are not here. So I'm going to pretty much stick here, because there's quite a lot I'd like to share this afternoon with you. I open my presentation with two quotes. Mungwara utwara itipa kamo haleng. A mother, a woman, handles the sharp end of the sword. Ndebelini's understanding on cultures of survival talks about, even under the most oppressive of conditions, people are always trying and struggling to maintain a semblance of normal social order. They will apply custom, tradition to manage their day-to-day family problems, resort to socially acquired behavior patterns to work out their means of existence. Thank you. They apply system and values that they know. Often these values will undergo changes under certain pressing condition. Transformation of those values constitutes the essential drama in the lives of ordinary people. So today I want to talk about that, the notion of negotiating uncertainty that is going around corners, giving and taking, creating perspectives from the cracks, surviving in the midst of siege, surviving patriarchy, as our speakers before me have spoken about, sexism, racism, classism, xenophobia, while at the same time growing strong in these assaulted hegemonic terrains, and ultimately utilizing them as a basis to carve an alternative conception of humanity and citizenship is African women's existential and ontological conditions of existence. So the work today, I'd like to draw on some of the work that I've been doing for the past more than 15 years or so, which has focused on the lived and embodied experiences of suffering and healing among township working class women. I've done some work on gendered memories of violence, particularly looking at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And some of my work has looked at African cultural production, particularly focusing on the role of women. And so in digging in all of these areas in what I call my three-legged theoretical standpoint, theoretical standpoint, this is what has really shaped what I want to share with you today. So it comes from a number of works, a number of insights that I've gained along the way. So I'm not going to be speaking directly. I just want to make that clear, and I made that clear to the organizers. As we know, the knowledge production project is a process. So I'm hoping through sharing some of the the work that I've been doing for the past decade or two, we begin to have a conversation around opening our conversation on how to engender the humanities and social sciences curriculum, because some of us have been trying to do this for quite a while. So I want to start off with the idea of meaning making. I think that's the center of the project, of the knowledge project, is about the whole notion of the creation of meaning. And I want to really argue that in focusing on African women's creation of meaning, and that is how they navigate uncertainty. We are in fact also advancing theoretical frameworks which are centrally about the rehumanization of the oppressed. So I want to propose that centering our intellectual labor on exploring and understanding women's epistemic frames and ontological conditions invites us to their theoretically silenced and forgotten memory sites, their bodies, their dreams, their tears, the sacred, desire, death. And in doing so, this might help us to reimagine what a gendered humanities and social sciences South African curriculum might look like. And as we engage in this reimagining as thinkers, who particularly, I'm talking to those thinkers who engage in looking at African women's life, we're also aware that we are partaking in a very important theoretical exercise, which is around building the African Women's Archive.
Thank you very much. I'm particularly grateful for that introduction of the have-beens in my life, and I'm particularly grateful for it because I'm speaking about lessons from the past. So all of the have-beens become really good credentials for talking about what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, I know that I have 20 minutes, and the likelihood that I'll get through what I'm supposed to get through is very slim. So what I'll be doing is first to read out some kind of abstract to give you a sense of what I'm going to be talking about, and some beginning notes to give you a sense of where I'm coming from and what I think the major conceptual and theoretical issues that I want to center are about. It's usually said that the lecturer is the one who talks while the audience goes to sleep. If today you find that the lecturer goes to sleep, don't be particularly surprised. Yeah, so the broad theme brief that I've been given is lessons from the Heinemann African Writers series. I've tried to narrow this slightly to talk about decolonization, the African Writers series, and the making of a transnational Pan-African literary audience. So what I begin with some kind of abstract, as I said. This paper argues that in spite of the many critiques of the Heinemann African Writers series and its role in the making of modern African literature and its canon, there are lessons to be learned from it at this moment of South African higher education, when the clamor for decolonization has reached a new peak as a result of the student protests of the past few years. In making this argument, I recognize and acknowledge the legitimacy and validity of several of the critiques that have been made of the Heinemann African Writers series. However, I go on to note and highlight several of the practices set in motion by the African Writers series that would be hugely beneficial to the South African decolonization project. These include, but are not limited to, providing accessibility. One of the major complaints of teachers of African and other minority literatures is the fact that they have to look for their text again and again to put in student readers. The second is the production of low-cost paperbacks, which made it possible in these recently decolonized countries of the 60s and 70s for people to afford all of the novels that were recommended. And they had paperbacks selling for as little as 25p at that time, which was affordable to people. And I think this is a lesson that South Africa could learn. Another is the republishing and reprinting of old classic texts and titles that had gone out of print. Another is the focus on translations, that you could translate across several literary traditions, so that French novels, for example, were translated very quickly into, well, let me say, Francophone African novels and poems, were translated quickly into English, therefore creating an archive of texts which became available across the various language divides of the continent. Another was the mining of the school market, which actually ensured the survival of the Heinemann African Writers series as a commercial project. And finally, and this will be what I may concentrate on in the end, the promotion of a pedagogic imaginary, or what else we have referred to as the creation of teacherly texts in the making of the canon of modern African literature. Texts that could strive from the publishers' offices right into the classroom. Finally, it is important to note, by way of a temporal historical conjunction.
My name is Nolita, which basically means light, as it falls on me as I speak to you. And my surname is Vukuza. I'm the Senior Executive Director in the Vice Chancellor's Office here at UJ. So Professor Ade, when he was willing me to participate, he said, as a true African, I must come and chair. So here I am. I grew up in the Eastern Cape, here in South Africa, in a rural village called Mugwalana. It is the part of the Eastern Cape that is the most beautiful, with beautiful landscapes, vast rivers that have been given a different name. The Fish River, which formerly was known as Nguba. And when people couldn't pronounce it, they gave it the name Fish River. I also come from the Eastern Cape, the valleys of Mpekweni, which are known for its fruits, pineapple, oranges. Of course, this part of South Africa could not escape the admiration and the greed of both the Brits and the Germans. And as such, we have villages around mine called German Village, Frankfurt, Stutteram, Berlin, Potsdam, you name it. That's where I come from. My father took us to a school called St. Matthew's College, which was an Anglican school that was run by white people. My teacher was Mrs. Pike from Scotland. Of course, we all wanted to look like Mrs. Pike. We wanted to speak like Mrs. Pike. We wanted to sit like Mrs. Pike. We wanted to think like her. She taught us all these things. She framed the way we look at things. She taught us girls not to speak loudly. She taught us to have and look after our hands so that they are soft. And she taught us not to stand the sight of blood. This is regardless of the fact that by that time I had killed many chickens for my provision to take me to college. Was it wrong to learn all these things? Professor Adebayo yesterday spoke about something similar, and he said there's nothing wrong with learning about Shakespeare, as long as you balance what you learn with what we know. And so really there is nothing wrong with John Keats, his appreciation of beauty when he says a thing of beauty is a joy forever. There's nothing wrong with that. Indeed, he balances that appreciation with S.E.K. Mkai, who also appreciates his dog, Umbambushe. And of course, my appreciation of Shakespeare should have been balanced with S.E.K. Mkai's Umbambushe.
First of all, let me express my appreciation to KF for this invitation, because there's a lot that is said about transformation of the curriculum in the South African context. There's a lot that is said about decolonization, but very few actual, what I'll call serious debates and discussions about what you replace this with. and it's good to meet so many old friends again. Let me try and it's something that I broached to Keye. Sorry, I call him Keye, because that tells you, the shared origin. And I remember quipping with him at home-based restaurant in Pretoria. Why are you saying, from Ebony, from Ivory Tower to Ebony Tower? And he said, well, why don't you say it at the conference? So it's a quip, But I think it relates to the core of what I will be discussing, which is that about Pan-Africanism is not about pigmentation. And I think in the South African context, it's useful to remind ourselves of that. Actually, ivory, between ivory and ebony, ivory is the one that is indigenous to Africa. The only animal from which you get ivory in significant quantities is the African elephant. It doesn't have any other something. Ebony, on the other hand, from all the way from Sri Lanka to West Africa, you get ebony. And in terms of the problem setting again, so the point there, and I'll come back to this, the idea that it's important to remind ourselves that Pan-Africanism is not about pigmentation. And also on the continent, and I don't want to sound controversial here, that South African race discourse doesn't travel much. Let me give us an example. There are people we call colored here, but these are my cousins, So my uncle married an English person, but this is my cousin. So and the people who say people are colored are the ones whose texture changes with temperature and temperament and so on and so forth. So when you say colored people, But I'd like to locate the whole idea of the transformation of the sociology curriculum within the framework of what I call the Amy Caesar challenge. To avoid to avoid world segregation in the particular, while at the same time avoiding being diluted in the universal. I think we need to focus on what we want rather than what we're against. But that's where the real work lies. Less about decolonization. Definitely not about decoloniality. And I've had that used very frequently in the South African context. At the core of the decoloniality discourse is that the decolonization project is an illusion. Walter Mignogno will talk about what they call it, locus of enunciation, but decoloniality discourse, locus of enunciation, is the catharsis of Latino and Latinas in North American universities and how to relate to their own continent. I wouldn't be here if the decolonization project in the African context is an illusion. And anybody who's read Nkrumah, and this nonsense that I've heard repeatedly about Nkrumah saying, seek ye first the political kingdom and everything else shall be given unto you, as if Nkrumah didn't worry about the economic, didn't worry about the epistemic and so on and so forth. I think what is important is that we need to focus more about what I call endogeneity. That every sociological scholarship, every good social science scholarship is grounded in a specific locale. As Achima Feje will argue, all knowledge is first local, and global knowledge is a contradiction in terms.
I wish to thank the conference organizers for the privilege afforded me in the invitation to share my thoughts on the transformation of the South African curriculum through African philosophy. I do so tentatively in the knowledge that I speak with an imperfect and an incomplete voice, a voice that makes no claim to truth or finality. Mokgobe Rimozi reminds us that for at least 3 centuries, since the conquest of the indigenous people in the unjust wars of colonization, the education curriculum in South Africa did not include African philosophy. For the colonial conqueror and the successor entitled thereto, the indigenous conquered peoples had neither an epistemology nor a philosophy worth including in any education curriculum. This clear reminder succinctly captures the post-colonial predicament that is being addressed in the conference. And in responding to this existential and human predicament in my address, I want us to critically reflect this morning on an epistemic vision that is captured in what I refer to as a post-modern disposition. There is a growing literature on attempts to critically understand and apply the concept of postmodernism in African philosophy, and by extension, the analysis of the post-colonial African predicament. In embracing a postmodern turn for African philosophy in its efforts to transform South Africa's curriculum, I have assumed a critical standpoint regarding modernity and the philosophies of the Enlightenment that underpinned it. The postmodern turn in this is aptly captured by West as a drive to trash, and I quote, the monolithic and homogeneous in the name of diversity, multiplicity, and heterogeneity, to reject the abstract, general, and universal in the light of the concrete, specific and particular, and to historicize, contextualize, and pluralize by highlighting the contingent, provisional, variable, tentative, shifting, and changing. Postmodernism, therefore, emerges, as Sim notes, as a rejection of many, if not most, of the cultural certainties on which life, particularly in the West, has been structured over the last couple of centuries. And he then goes on to assert, and I quote, that if by postmodernism we refer to the deployment of philosophy to question and possibly overturn the grand narratives and universalizing theories in culture, both at the theoretical and political level, then there cannot be any question concerning its relevance to post-colonial Africa. In fact, Sim concludes that it is in the formerly colonized cultures, more than anywhere else, that the power and promise of postmodernism as a critical theory of society is seriously required. In like manner, Kenzo, and I quote once again, says that it is legitimate to think of Africa in terms of postmodernism because the present post-colonial situation calls for it, and it is beneficial to think about Africa in terms of postmodernism because postmodernism clears free space at the margins of Enlightenment reason, where true alterity can be sought and expressed.
Okay, good morning, colleagues, and thank you again to Professor Ade, and good to meet you after lengthy email conversation, and Dr. Naga and Cecilia for the labor of putting this conference together. Not being a churchgoer, I'm quite happy to be here on a Sunday. I won't be talking about law or the work of attempting to decolonize or critically interrogate the discipline of law. I want to take a step back and to share some thoughts that came my way and that have been nagging me since the student protests of 2015 began, when I myself was in the process of completing my doctoral studies. And it's really an attempt by a young academic to try and understand what I might call the socio-cultural dynamics that attend to the question of decolonization today. For the most part, I hope it's going to be coherent. Okay. The terms decolonization, decolonizing, and their Latin American cousin, decolonial, now travel with unprecedented ubiquity and promiscuity across higher education and public discourse. As a successor and rival to the worn projects of transformation, and to a lesser extent, Africanization, decolonization has risen to prominence as the supervening motif and buzzword employed by South African academics and universities struggling to respond to the accumulated contradictions of South Africa's colonial and apartheid history, thrown into sharper relief by the World Historical Student Protests of 2015-2017. A cursory review of recent books, edited collections, journal articles, lecture series, summer schools, and conference programs in the South African Academy leaves one hard-pressed not to find academics engaged in the project of decolonizing this or that discipline and concept, or positing a decolonial critique or reading of some text or phenomenon. This excessive proliferation of decolonization as a trendy noun and verb in the academic and institutional life of the South African University raises inescapable questions about its integrity and value as a political imaginary and epistemic signifier. But of course, the discourse and politics of decolonization is taking shape, but is also being hollowed out, I think, in a tangled global cultural and political terrain. Two features of this terrain I briefly want to mention is, on the one hand, the provenance of social media. The fact that social media has democratized the sharing of subversive knowledge at the same time as it has resulted in the proliferation of anti-intellectualism writ large. It has also facilitated the rapid and mostly uncritical importation of especially North American political idioms traveling under the sign of wokeness into the South African campus. That's the one dimension. The social media is playing itself out in the classroom and in the university. Perhaps the second and more significant feature of the problem of thinking about decolonization is something that the philosopher Charles Mills has called white ignorance. Contrary to how this room looks, the upper echelons of the South African Academy remain disproportionately white. And as whiteness is inseparable from the historical unfoldment of colonialism, imperialism, and racism, the demand for decolonized spaces and curricula will struggle for legibility and validation within an antagonistic and indifferent institutional, socio-cultural, and epistemic field. The endless harangue and complaints by white academics depicting calls for decolonized curricula as either vague or nativist or atavistic or unscholarly or overly identitarian or outrightly racist is a symptom of an orthodox dismissiveness that Charles Mills has named white ignorance. Now, in his famous account of white epistemologies of ignorance, Mills tracks the ways in which the historical installation of systems of colonial conquest and white supremacy were accompanied by a particular, he calls, optic, a prism of perception and interpretation and worldview tied to whiteness, which in turn produces a particular cognitive orientation to the world, grounded in the acceptance of Eurocentric cultural assumptions and generating a specific pattern of knowing and seeing, or rather not knowing and not seeing.
Thank you, our chair, who has done a lot of work on some of what we're talking about, especially on oral history. And it's a pleasure for me to be in the same panel with Boubacar Bari. We've gone a long way together. And many of you may not remember the essay that generated a crisis many years ago by Philip Cotton, Ghetto Sites in Africa, which was published in the Chronicles of Higher Education, which put cotton in serious trouble. What happened is Rice recruited Odiambo. I was targeted by 6 universities, and I went to Texas because of the climate, and Boubacar was to go to Duke, and this enraged Cotton, who said, why can't we all stay back in Africa, and why do we want to ghettoize Africa in the continent? Of course, people were angry. And many of you may not remember Nolushongo, who was to become one of the vice chancellors in one of your universities. And before he accepted it, he died, which is very unfortunate. To some of you here, my encounter with South Africa is very deep. I've met all your presidents except the current one, and I serve on one of the foundations of Thabo Mbeki. So it's always a pleasure for me to be here. I always do my politics because I always seek manuscripts. I've published many of my colleagues in South Africa. I recently established a series with Cambridge University Press on identities. And we have commissioned our colleagues here to write about the Zulu and some other groups. And we are releasing a book on same-sex marriage, other forms of identities. So if you have manuscripts on identities, do please talk to me before the meeting is over. You send me an email. And I manage a series with the University of Rochester Press on the diaspora. I've been doing this series for almost 20 years now. And for Routledge, I do a series on globalization, global history. For Macmillan, I do a series on past histories. For Carolina Academic Press, I do collected essays like the essays of Magubane, if the professor wants to put those together. That's my commercial. I've enjoyed the conference tremendously, and we've covered some of the following issues: the role of universities, which the Vice Chancellor started on, epistemologies, the expansion and funding of universities, social movements and transformation of campuses, with examples from Rhodes and with examples from other places. Indigenous modes of knowing, we've covered them, and epistemic sources of knowing. I want to say that some of these issues have nowhere to go. We should encourage conversation on them, and we cannot close ideas on them. And each era will determine what is important to it.
Let me take this opportunity also to thank the Institute for inviting me to come to Johannesburg to participate in this important conference. And thirdly, let me thank the last speaker for providing me the entry point for my discussion, because the Dar es Salaam School of Political Economy succeeded the African nationalist historiography. They succeeded in writing African history using novel methodologies, motivating institutions and relevancies, but as history as a discipline failed to capture the development failures that we're experiencing in the 50s and 60s. So there arose the need, therefore, to look for a new multidisciplinary approach to capture the development trajectory that we wanted at that time. That is, in the mid-60s, we came up, Africa, actually what they call organic intellectuals, those who are really engaged with the real problems of the underprivileged and oppressed working people, looked for a methodology to understand how to address the challenges of development. And they borrowed what we refer to as a political economy approach that is borrowed from Marxian political economy, which was operationalized to understand the African specific historical circumstances using their tools, but at the same time, fully recognizing that Africa was a neo-colonial economy or neo-colonial economies, that Africa was not industrial, and therefore you are dealing largely with peasant societies, and that Africa had a small modern sector in the midst of peasant economies, that Africa had poorly consolidated class and class organizations and structures, therefore, therefore they had to domesticate Marxian political economy to address all these contingencies. My paper is structured as follows, looking at the underpinnings of Marxian political economy, the context of political economy in Dar es Salaam, the praxis of political economy in Tanzania, and lessons to draw off. The underpinnings of Marxian political economy. Marxian political economy is an integrated analytics of the economy, society, and politics, but specifically looking at the basis for each and every society at particular times. Marxian political economy, secondly, is a normative framework. It prioritizes the interest of the working class and marginalized groups vis-a-vis the capitalist classes, institutional structures, and ideologies that support them. Marxian political economy seeks to analyze class interests, class struggles, and strategies for alternative development. Therefore, Marxian political economy, as a tool of knowledge production and dissemination, uses this for not only analyzing and explaining what is taking place, but also to create an alternative future. So in Dar es Salaam, this takes place in the mid-60s. And here we are looking at factors why in Dar es Salaam in the 60s, and we find out a few factors that came in place, that is context. The first factor is the promulgation of the national policy of socialism and self-reliance as a new development framework for development in Tanzania. And this new policy was against what we had experienced in the first 10 years of independence. And this also attracted left-leaning scholars from all over the world, students, liberation movement activists, and political exiles that gathered in Dar es Salaam to form a critical mass to debate, to discuss, and to identify development strategies and evaluate what was taking place in Tanzania.
I would like first to pay tribute to Samir Amin, to Kofi Annan, and Aretha Franklin. All of them have done their job in this world by serving this continent and the whole world. But I would like to pay particularly tribute to Samir Amin, that I know for the last 50 years in Dakar. And Samir Amin, as an economist, in 1972 wrote the preface of my book as an historian, The Kingdom of Walu. I can say that this book became famous because of the preface of Samir Amin. He gave a theoretical explanation of the origin of the underdevelopment of Africa. And our generation are grateful to Samir Amin. I would like also to thank Professor Adedeji Adebayo, Adekeyo Adebayo, for inviting me to this conference and giving me the opportunity to come back in South Africa and to meet my friend Falola, Adesi, and so on. I must apologize for one thing first. I make a confusion between Olokoshi and Professor Adebayo at the beginning. But it is a good confusion because both of them has done a lot for this continent. And I must apologize also not bringing a proper paper for this conference. I cannot explain why. It is the first time that I cannot submit a paper in my venue to a conference. But I think that it is because I make a confusion in the topics. And I send a text, Écrire Writing History in Post-Colonial Africa, the case of School of Dakar, but are presented in Cape Town with Mahmoud Mamdani in 1997. And nothing has changed since this time. I don't think my paper is out of order. It's still available. But I'm not here to read my paper or to explain it, because it is very difficult for me now to read and to write at least. I'm going back to the oral tradition, if you permit to me. And I would like to take this opportunity to share with you my own journey of decolonization since I was 3 years old. I lived 75 years of decolonization process. And you will see at the end if I am enough strong to go to the second step of non-decolonization, but building this continent for ourselves. And I like the term Africanization. I will try to give you some part of my own experience as a person living in this period, but also my own experience as an actor, because I participate in this process of decolonization, not all, but in this particular discipline of history, with my discipline.
Thank you so much. My voice has issues, but I hope I will communicate. Lessons from Kenya are very well known around the world, right from the days of the Mau Mau War, when land was the issue, up to the time of independence. During the Pan-African movement, Jomo and other Pan-Africanists worked, especially in England, for freedom for Africa. And I always remember Peter Abrahams, the South African novelist, who worked with Kenyatta in those days, and he wrote this novel called Arithfo Domo. Arithfo Domo is the only Pan-African novel that I know. But that is not the issue today. Today we want to talk about the curriculum in the literature department at the University of Nairobi. When you talk about the curriculum at the University of Nairobi, you must see it in the perspective of decolonization from the British system of education, when examinations were set in Cambridge and administered right here, in Kenya, from Cambridge. Now, that system of examination was organized by British educators. Now, the decolonization process took the form of transferring the ownership of that process to East Africa, so that in the 60s, towards independence, the East African countries had their own exam system called the East African Exam Council. In the process, of course, as we were becoming more nationalistic, each country was running its own examinations. So there is a way in which the East African community, there was a lull in its activities, and in the process, individual countries went their way. And there was an obvious ideological shift where Tanzania had its own views about education, Kenya had its own, and Kampala had its own. But what is gratifying is that East African countries had a citadel of learning in Kampala at Makerere. Makerere served as the original university, and if University of Nairobi broke off, University of Dar es Salaam broke off, but they still remained more or less together in the devolution of the curriculum, to the extent that when the University of Nairobi became independent from the East Africa, in terms of when the University of Nairobi broke off from the East African, university, they now began doing their own thing. And that was in the 1970s when, in fact, the process of decolonization in the Department of English at the University of Nairobi started. And it more or less started accidentally, because the chairman of the head of the department, the English department, who happened to be a white South African, wrote a paper, a proposal about improving, changing the curriculum in English. He says the time is especially opportune for the planning and gradual formation of a Department of Language and Linguistics. He was not in for literature. He was in for language and linguistics. And this is what brought sort of the ire to the local scholars, led by Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
Good afternoon. I'm still thinking on the time in the United States. Well, it's my privilege to be here, and I'm very thankful to Don and Cecilia, more so than Ade, because they did all the communications with us. And the presentation on the case of Ghana, the way I see it, is not to educate South Africa, but rather to share experiences that may give opportunity for conversation regarding what South Africa is trying to do here. But before I go on, let me make a number of observations. One is that universities do not make education policies. Rather, they discuss content of education and influence policies. And centers such as the Pan-Africanist Center has a great responsibility in influencing and articulating research that can actually be very useful. Universities do not create jobs. Rather, they train individuals in certain skills that can help its graduates to be very useful citizens and be very innovative and contribute to the creation of the environment within which skills can be applied to improve the environment. Then, of course, the universities, as places for knowledge production, especially in developing countries, face the challenge, especially in the case of Ghana and in terms of the methods that have been applied to study the local histories. How do you study the content which the local people claim to know already? That's a very important question to put forth. And then, of course, we have politicians who also view the university, even when they supported it initially, when they come up with solutions that are contradictory to what they want to implement, then begin to question the value of the scholars who are doing the research. All these cases have happened in Ghana. So as we present, we may talk about what is very nice, but I hope that when we come to the question and answer time, we will have the opportunity to discuss some of the challenges. As I was preparing this presentation, I first read a context paper that came from South Africa, and I was very blown away in terms of the challenges facing academic knowledge production since 1994. So I went reading around, trying to see how to frame my research work, and I found one written by Ali Mazrui in 2003, titled Towards Re-Africanization of African Universities, and subtitled Who Killed Intellectualism in the Post-Colonial Era. In that work, he made a very interesting opening statement, and then, of course, his concluding statement, which I have compressed into this. Ali Mazrui said, and actually raised a question, how can a university help to develop the society in which it belongs? This question was immediately followed by an apt observation that, and I quote, no university is able to help develop a society unless the society is ready to help the university develop. And then, of course, he ended that long essay, which was a public presentation in Kenya, actually, to say that no university will become a good university unless the students who are being trained in the pre-tertiary level are equipped efficiently to enter that university. And I compress this into one because in the case of Ghana, the Africanization, if we may say so, encompassed the whole system of education, not just the university education.
Actually, what my paper is about the prehistory of African and African-American studies. When Cecilia spoke about the institutionalization of African-American studies in the American Academy, she rightly pointed out that it was part of a political movement and that students recognized that their histories, their cultures had been overlooked in the American Academy and rightly demanded that these stories be recognized. What I want to look at is how did it come to be that that in the United States, a place where people of African descent were living on American soil before American soil was American soil. In other words, the first people of African descent arrived at American shores in 1618, 1619. The United States didn't even exist until 1776. So how do we have this idea that somehow those histories are extraneous, or histories that are the histories of those people who are not quite American, whereas the histories of German Americans, Irish Americans, many of whom arrived in as late as 1918, 1919, 1920, their histories and stories are unproblematically part of a universal and generalized story. So really what I want to talk about today is how did that come to be, and what possible lessons are to be learned from positioning, from deciding to make your point of entry something that is in addition to, rather than seeking to perhaps explode what the idea of the center is. So, in 1996, on the occasion of his suspension from the course of his own design called Problematizing Africa, Professor Mahmoud Mamdani wrote an essay called, Is African Studies at UCT to be Turned into a New Home for Bantu Education? In that essay, Mamdani pointed out how the orientation of African studies at the University of Cape Town was inadequate to a post-apartheid academy. Rather, it collected in a colonial epistemology. As he said, quote, historically, African studies developed outside Africa, not within it. It was a study of Africa, but not by Africans. The key division was between the disciplines and area studies. The disciplines studied the white experience as universal human experience. Area studies studied the experience of people of color as an ethnic experience, close quote. So really what I want to talk about, as I said, is the prehistory of the disciplines of African and African-American studies that Mamdani makes mention of in his critique. My particular focus will be on how and why a conceptual architecture for the study of people of African descent developed that reified the distinction between the universal and the particular. So in order to begin to understand how this came to be, one of the things we need to do is to explode some of the myths about the university itself. Yesterday, a provocative word called propaganda was being thrown around. I don't think it was appropriate in the context in which it was used yesterday, what was being called propaganda. However, there is a tremendous amount of propaganda around universities and knowledge that we kind of take unproblematically. One of those things being that universities developed or existed for the abstract search for truth. That somehow the university in the form that we know today, which are disciplines dedicated to the study of particular things, you know, economists, the economy, historians, the past, politics, allegedly the sphere called the political, sociologists, the so-called modern, anthropology, the other. The fact that somehow those things just developed sui generis. Actually, if you look at the history of the study of persons, why people thought it was necessary to make people and the social the object of inquiry, we quickly see, particularly in the United States, but also in South Africa, that the history of social science reflects the fact that America, like all post-emancipation societies, struggled with the fact that freed slaves took it upon themselves to establish the basis of their new freedom. Given the chance, emancipated slaves never voluntarily returned to the fields, nor did they embrace the idea of being wage laborers, or, as the parlance of the time held it, wage slaves.
So the cry of African people all over the world is R-E-S-P-E-C-T. Find out what it means to me. Rest in peace, Aretha Franklin. Material resources are central to maintaining oppression. The oppressed are often granted only basic resources that are necessary for subsistence. Because oppression will always be challenged, it requires brute power that's backed by violence and money. When faced with overwhelming violence and starvation, the oppressed are trapped in a state of powerlessness. Ignorance also constitutes a critical link in the chain of oppression. History shows that while violence and material deprivation are necessary for oppression, they are not sufficient. The oppressed often revolt, even though before them lies the open grave. Oppressors make sure that the oppressed endure mental chains that are just as crippling as physical shackles. It is difficult to oppress people who critically analyze the sources of their degradation. Submissive attitudes are required for oppression to endure. Rulers need subjects to adjust to their oppression and experience it as natural. When this occurs, the oppressed experience their subjugation as something being outside of their own control, as if it was the will of God. So that attitudes of obedience lead to oppressed groups who succumb to cultures of submission. These attitudes produce resignation. Indeed, passivity is the handmaiden of oppression. Now, liberation education is the enemy of passivity. Oppressors know that it is dangerous for oppressed people to be enlightened. Thus, American slaves were forbidden to learn to read, write, and think for themselves. Enlightenment causes slaves to become mentally liberated. Harriet Tubman, the great leader of the American Underground Railroad, concluded that she could have freed a lot more slaves if only they knew that they were slaves. An education that liberates the mind is necessary for freedom. However, all education does not liberate. Oppressive education serves as the opiate of the masses because it teaches obedience. So that the father of African American history, Carter G. Woodson, explained what he called miseducation. Quote, "If you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his action. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel that he's inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it out himself. If you make a man think that he's justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there's no back door, his very nature will demand one," end quote. Liberation education, on the other hand, causes the oppressed to become disobedient and develop bad tempers. Throughout the American slave and Jim Crow regimes, white oppressors struggled to prevent the oppressed from acquiring education that was enlightening. So during slavery, harsh penalties were leveled against slaves who dared to learn to read and write. So then here's a law in North Carolina during slavery. It says to teach a slave to read or write, or to sell or give him a book, and the Bible not being exempted, or a pamphlet, is punished with 39 lashes or imprisonment. The reason for this law is that teaching slaves to read and write tends to dissatisfaction in their minds and to produce insurrections and rebellions, end quote.
I want to thank the Institute for inviting me to participate in this, this important event. And the organizers, Cecilia, Dawn, Ade, have been really excellent and did a wonderful job, I think, organizing this. I get to just, I think, jump right into my, my topic. I think Zine gave, and even Walter Allen's paper, presentation yesterday, I think, gave a good enough overview that I don't feel like I have to go into too much of the details of the HBCUs and Howard, Howard's history in particular. So my paper focuses on the lessons of the Howard School of IR theory, and I'm adopting that term, that specific term from Robert Vitalis, who just wrote a book, well, in 2015 wrote a book, White World Order, Black Power Politics, where he introduces that term. But I would say that the first person to use that term was Charles Henry, who actually coined the term the Howard School of Race Relations, I believe it specifically was. But one of the points that I want to highlight in my paper is the point that Zine makes in that when Charles Henry raised that issue or introduced the concept of the Howard School in the context of African American studies, it really didn't get very much attention. But once Robert Vitalis, who happens to be a white American scholar teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, writes a book about the Howard School, all of a sudden it puts them on the map. And so I'm here now from Howard to kind of pick up on some of that narrative, but some of the points that I'm trying to make are a little bit different. So basically, my paper draws and tries to draw lessons from this collection or this constellation of black intellectual leaders that were on the campus of Howard University beginning in the late 1920s up through the 1950s and even beyond if we look at some of them. So one of the kind of main thrust of the argument that I'm trying to make in the paper is that the Howard scholars collectively provide us with a decolonial, methodological, and scholarly research agenda that centers around three strategies. So the first being this, their concerted and consistent attempts and efforts at problematizing hegemonic paradigms, theories, and schools of thought. And here again, the Howard scholars are probably most known for their interventions in theorizing race and race relations, especially in the United States, or that's how it's oftentimes framed. I'm going to push back on that a little bit in terms of what I think that they were doing at the time. So that's more well known, but what's less known is their work contributing to the field of international relations in theorizing hierarchy as one of the primary or the primary organizing principle of the world system. And that's certainly equally relevant, if not more relevant, to the decolonial project that I think that we're talking about and decolonial transformation that we're talking about today. Their epistemic, so the second one is demythologizing history. And again, here I'll bring in some of the works of Eric Williams as well. And here, their epistemic and methodological commitment to the colonized and the subaltern. We've talked before about really the need to center the subaltern and the marginalized communities and center their stories and narratives in our history and in our analysis of the world, of the international system. And their treatment of slavery and colonialism as constitutive of the contemporary world system served, and this, as I say, serves to center these experiences and knowledges of the non-European in these historical narratives. And then the third strategy that they consistently, again, that you consistently see in their work is decolonizing knowledge production. And here, their emphasis on relational research and using relational methodology in their research and in their scholarship that binds the differential fortunes of the people of the metropole with those of the periphery, provides a necessary counter to the tendency to fragment these histories as we've had many speakers, but I know somebody was raising the issue of fragmentation, which is absolutely key.